October 14, 1942. The morning sun poured down on a quiet corner of occupied Poland, painting the countryside in piercing blues and brittle shadows. The temperature hovered at 6 degrees Celsius, a chill that stung the skin and settled into the bones. Somewhere in the distance, a German supply train screamed along the tracks, a monstrous serpent of steel and smoke. It was a fortress on wheels, carrying millions of Reichsmarks in aviation fuel, armored to withstand bullets, and guarded by a dozen soldiers with machine guns. On paper it was unstoppable. But in a thin wooden cottage perched on the edge of the forest, 12-year-old Isef was not afraid. He was small, malnourished, with ribs visible beneath his shirt, but his mind was precise and unyielding. Today he did not hold a gun, a grenade, or a weapon of any kind. In his hands rested a broken lens, a fragment of his grandmother's glasses, curved and imperfect, but with a focus that could harness the sun's deadly energy. Isef adjusted the angle of the lens by a mere 2 millimeters, squinting through the glare, and waited for the train to approach the curve he had memorized with obsessive detail. 300 meters away, the rails glimmered under the sun. Isef's heartbeat remained steady, calm, almost clinical. He did not fight with brute force, he fought with physics. Every day for weeks, he had observed the trains, noting their patterns, the way the tankers slowed at the dead man's curve, the slight sag of the rails under their weight. He had learned patience. He had learned precision. And now the moment of truth had arrived. The train rounded the bend. Smoke and steam coiled into the crisp air, engines groaning under the weight of their cargo. Isef's eyes traced the line of tanker cars, the yellow diamond symbols marking the volatile fuel inside. He focused the lens, creating a pinpoint of blinding light on the valve of the third tanker. At first nothing happened. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then a shimmer appeared, a heat mirage that danced and vibrated with invisible energy. A microsecond later, a fireball erupted. The tanker didn't just ignite, it disintegrated in a roaring explosion that tossed twisted metal into the autumn sky. The force of the blast shook the ground beneath him, rattled the trees and incinerated the guards before they could lift their rifles. Isef rolled backward into the ditch behind the ridge, clutching the lens as if it were the most precious object in the world. In the valley below, the German High Command would spend months hunting for the perpetrators, sending commandos, interrogating hundreds of villagers, analyzing non-existent bomb fragments, all failing to find the true culprit. They never imagined a child. They never imagined sunlight as a weapon. This was not magic. It was thermodynamics. Isef had stumbled into a science so simple yet so lethal that the Germans had not calculated it. A lens concentrates photons and photons carry energy. Enough energy focused on a tiny point could raise the temperature above 500 degrees Celsius in seconds. The flash point of gasoline vapor was far below that. All it needed was a spark. And in that spark, Isef had become a weapon. He was not yet a soldier. He was not yet a hero. He was an observer. A student of destruction. He had discovered the principles by accident in the summer, when his grandmother had dropped her reading glasses. The left lens had popped out. On a hot July day, bored and curious, he had twisted it in his hands, letting the sunlight pass through. The beam fell on a dry pine needle on the porch railing. Smoke curled. A flash. Ignition. He had stared in disbelief, realizing the power he now held. Over the following weeks, he practiced with leaves, bark, and scraps of paper, learning to adjust for distance, wind, and the trembling of his own hands. He constructed a rudimentary bipod from branches, transforming himself into a sniper of light. Every failure taught him something about stability, focus, and patience. Each minor success fueled the confidence to attempt the impossible, the destruction of a fully loaded German fuel train. That morning, Isef crouched in the trees overlooking the valley, his small frame invisible among the branches. The first tanker car disintegrated, the second barely ignited, and the third, his final target, had erupted into an inferno that would become a mystery for the ages. The Germans were baffled, convinced that sabotage had involved explosives. But there were no traces, no fragments, no conventional signs of an attack. Only heat, light, and the ghostly silhouette of a boy who had bent physics to his will. Isef remained in the forest long after the chaos subsided. He watched as soldiers combed the area, searching for evidence that didn't exist. His lips pressed into a thin line, heart steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. He was no longer just a boy. He was a shadow, a ghost, the youngest saboteur the Third Reich would never anticipate. And while the smoke spiraled into the autumn sky, he realized that survival demanded secrecy, patience, and the courage to wield the sun itself. When he finally returned home, clutching the broken lens to his chest, he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. History had not yet recorded the smallest of its heroes. And Isef, armed with nothing more than sunlight and a fragment of glass, was about to become legend. August 1941. That summer day had ended Isef's childhood in a way that no child should ever endure. The village was quiet, deceptively quiet, as though the earth itself held its breath. When the SS truck rolled in, it wasn't seeking soldiers or fighters. It was searching for labor, for bodies to fuel the machinery of a merciless war. Isef had watched from the cellar, pressed flat against the wooden floorboards as men and women, neighbors, friends and family, were torn from their homes and dragged into the sunlight. His parents had been among them. His father, stoic even in chains, had tried to shield Isef with a glare of defiance. His mother had reached out, but the soldiers yanked her away before he could touch her. And then, in a swirl of dust and panic, they were gone. Isef saw them disappear into the blackness of a waiting truck. That was the last time he ever saw them. That was the instant a switch flipped inside him. Most children would have screamed. Most would have cried. Isef did neither. Instead he went numb. His mind, in a bid for survival, shut down the raw edges of grief. This was emotional blunting, a defense mechanism allowing him to function in a world that had just stripped him of everything. Isef became an observer, a silent witness to the horrors around him. He learned to see patterns in chaos, to calculate risks, to analyze without attachment. And above all, he learned to wait. He lived with his grandmother, Awa, a woman of granite and grief who had survived the German occupation with a kind of rigid defiance that terrified and inspired him. Together, they eked out a living in a leaning wooden cottage at the edge of the forest, its walls whispering with the wind and the secrets of the surrounding trees. Life was stripped down to its bare essentials: food, warmth, and survival. The world had narrowed to the rhythms of trains and patrols. The railway line ran through the valley about 500 meters from the cottage, a lifeline for the Nazi war machine. Every day Isef watched. 20, 30, sometimes 50 trains thundered past. Tanks for Stalingrad, winter coats for the Wehrmacht, artillery shells for sieges that seemed endless. He hated them, but not with the reckless anger of a child. He hated them with methodical curiosity, with the cold, calculating focus of someone plotting a path through a storm. It was a July afternoon when the accidental discovery occurred. Awa had dropped her reading glasses in the dirt while tending to the small garden. The frame snapped and the left lens popped out. Isef picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. It was thick, convex, imperfect, but in the sunlight, it held a promise he could not yet name. He aimed it at a dry pine needle on the porch railing. The sun passed through the glass, converging into a point of blinding light. Smoke curled upward. Then came a snap, a flash. The needle ignited. Isef's world changed in that instant. He had discovered the power of concentration, of energy focused. The sun, a passive, omnipresent force, could be weaponized. The lens was the trigger. Physics was his ally. He did not yet understand the magnitude of what he held, but he understood the potential. He experimented in silence, burning newsprint, leaves, twigs, each small fire a lesson in focus, timing, and precision. His days became exercises in observation and calculation. He memorized the train schedules with painstaking accuracy, noting the fuel transports by their yellow diamond symbols. He studied the valves and welds, the way the metal shimmered in the sun, the weak points where vapor could ignite. He sketched diagrams in the dirt, recreated the angles with sticks, calculated the focal points. Every detail mattered because in this war the smallest error could mean death, not just his but Awa's. The lens transformed him. He became part scientist, part strategist, part phantom. He learned about angles, distance, micro-adjustments, even the tremor of his own hands. On hot days he would use leaves floating in the creek as makeshift targets, practicing until he could ignite a moving leaf from 10 meters away. On cold mornings he tested the limits of the lens, discovering the threshold of light needed to spark flames on different surfaces. And yet, this was only preparation. The first train attack at Dead Man's Curve had been a stroke of luck, a trial by fire. Isef knew it. His ambition grew alongside his understanding. He would not be satisfied with small burns and minor victories. He wanted to stop the war machine, to make it pay in a way that the occupiers could not predict, could not comprehend. And he would do it not with bullets but with light. The discovery of the lens's potential was both a blessing and a curse. Isef had become aware that his power carried responsibility. One miscalculation could destroy not just the enemy but his home, his village, his grandmother. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him even as excitement coursed through his veins. He was no longer just a boy. He was a weapon being forged in the quiet of the forest. By late summer, the small fires he practiced with had become controlled, predictable, deadly. He had mastered the principles of focal points, intensity, and angle. He understood how to manipulate sunlight to ignite volatile materials. And he had learned patience. The patience of a predator waiting for the right moment, the perfect alignment of sun, lens, and target. As he sat on the roof of the cottage one evening, the lens warm in his hand, he watched the tracks below. The trains thundered by, oblivious, unknowing, unprotected against the smallest, most precise threat they would ever face. Isef was ready. The boy who had lost everything was prepared to use the sun itself as a weapon of war. That night, as Awa slept, Isef whispered to the shadows of the room, "I will not fail." And with that vow, the first chapter of the sun gun was complete. A 12-year-old child, armed with nothing but a broken lens and unwavering focus, had transformed curiosity into a deadly tool, and the war would never see him coming. The forest was silent, almost reverent as Isef settled into his training. Every day had become a ritual, a meditation on precision and patience. The broken lens rested in his palm like a living thing, a tool, a weapon, and a companion all in one. He had learned the lessons of trial and error. A trembling hand diffused the beam, a misplaced angle ruined the ignition, and even a slight shift of a leaf in the wind could render weeks of observation useless. He constructed a rudimentary sniper nest from fallen branches and hollow logs. The grooves carved into the wood allowed the lens to rest without slipping, eliminating microtremors from his pulse. The first attempts were humiliating. Leaves drifted through the sunlight, refused to ignite, and danced harmlessly along the stream. The pine needles blackened slightly, smoke curling in wisps, but never bursting into flame. He cursed himself under his breath, muttering physics formulas he barely understood, his small fists pounding the soil in frustration. But the failures were lessons. Isef learned about the path of light across the sky, the movement of the sun hour by hour, the way dust and pollen could scatter photons and reduce intensity. He measured distances carefully, using sticks and stones to mark intervals. 10 meters, 20, 30, eventually 50, 100. Every target, from a leaf to a scrap of paper, became a miniature proxy for the monstrous German trains that rumbled through the valley. He experimented with angles, rotating the lens minutely, observing how the light converged or diverged. He discovered that there was a sweet spot, where the beam focused to a pinhead of blinding heat. Too close, the light dispersed. Too far, and it weakened. Every adjustment mattered. Every fraction of a millimeter could be the difference between a faint smudge and a roaring flame. The first week was discouraging. Nothing ignited. By the second week, he scorched the edges of leaves. By the fourth week, he could set small pieces of bark aflame while they drifted down the creek. That was the moment he realized he was ready for more than practice. He understood that physics, patience, and precision could compensate for his small size, for his lack of a gun or explosives. He could be more dangerous than any soldier with a rifle. But Isef's training wasn't only physical. He had to fight fear as well. The memory of his parents' capture, the silent grief of his grandmother, and the constant patrols of the German soldiers pressed down on him like a weight. If he failed, if he was seen, Awa could be executed. He internalized the rules of survival, learning to blend with shadows, move like the wind, and breathe without disturbing the world around him. His body grew lean and strong from crawling through underbrush, climbing trees, and balancing on branches for hours at a time. He turned his lessons into a game, tracking floating bark as though it were a train. He marked imaginary valves, calculated distances in his head, and visualized the ignition points. Each successful flame was a confirmation, a small victory, proof that he could bend the laws of physics to his will. And each failure taught humility, patience, and respect for the power he wielded. Isef began to see patterns not only in trains but in the environment itself. The valley was alive with variables. Wind currents shifting through the trees, clouds drifting slowly across the sky, dust motes reflecting sunlight in unpredictable ways. He adapted, learning to wait for still air, for the sun at just the right height, for moments of perfect clarity. Nature itself became part of his training regimen, an invisible teacher demanding meticulous attention. Then came the moment he had been preparing for, the dead man's curve. He had mapped it meticulously, the grade of the track, the radius of the bend, the speed at which fuel trains slowed. He had memorized the schedules, knowing exactly which day, which hour, and which car he would target. This was not improvisation. This was calculation. This was precision. The culmination of weeks of preparation, failures, and victories distilled into a single plan executed by a boy armed with sunlight. He spent the night before the attack sleepless, rehearsing every step in his mind. The placement of the lens, the angle to the sun, the trajectory of the beam. He calculated the effects of distance, temperature, and humidity. Even the slightest error could compromise everything. He knew the trains carried fuel, tanks, and ammunition. One mistake could set off a chain reaction that would obliterate not just the enemy but his home, the forest, and possibly his grandmother. Yet the thought of inaction gnawed at him more than fear ever could. When morning came, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Frost clung to leaves and branches, sparkling in the rising sun. Isef moved silently, placing his lens in the log mount, crouching behind the ridge that overlooked the curve. The world was reduced to the glint of steel on the rails, the rhythm of the approaching train, and the pinpoint of concentrated light in his hands. His heart, trained by trauma and discipline, remained steady. His mind was calm, precise, and deadly focused. This was the moment where apprenticeship ended and action began. Weeks of observation, calculation, and experimentation converged into an instant of pure execution. Isef understood the stakes. He was not a boy anymore. He was the shadow in the trees, the unseen agent of chaos, and the first chapter of the Sun Gun's legacy was about to be written. As the engine roared into view, black smoke curling into the morning sky, Isef adjusted the lens one final time. The light danced briefly across the steel, converging into the deadly focal point he had calculated. For the first time he realized the true power of what he held. He could ignite fear, destruction, and chaos without lifting a single conventional weapon. He was ready. The forest was silent, but within that silence, a storm was about to erupt. October 14, 1942. The morning sky over occupied Poland was a piercing blue, cold and clear, as though the universe itself had sharpened its focus on the valley below. Frost clung to the grass and twigs, glittering in the early sunlight. The forest was silent, holding its breath, while Isef, small and wiry, crouched behind a cluster of gray rocks on the ridge. The broken lens rested in his palm, wrapped in a cloth to hide it from prying eyes, but ready to unleash devastation in an instant. For weeks he had prepared for this moment. Every calculation, every trial, every failure had led here. The Dead Man's Curve was a notorious bend in the railway line, where trains slowed to navigate the grade. Tankers carrying fuel, supplies for tanks, and ammunition for soldiers passed through with predictable regularity. The curve was a choke point, a natural trap that demanded nothing but patience, observation, and the precise application of sunlight. At 11:42 a.m., the first vibration shivered through the ground. Isef froze. His eyes scanned the valley, measuring distance and angle with a precision that belied his age. The black iron locomotive appeared around the bend, belching smoke, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails echoing through the valley. 12 soldiers manned the train, rifles slung and eyes alert, but they were no match for what they could not see. Isef positioned the lens in the log mount he had crafted from hollowed wood. It fit snugly, eliminating the micro-tremors of his pulse. He angled it toward the third tanker, calculating the convergence of sunlight into a deadly focal point on the relief valve. This was the weak spot, the place where vapor could ignite with terrifying speed. One miscalculation could fail or worse, reveal him. One perfect strike could destroy the train in seconds. The world seemed to slow. The sun glinted off the steel, reflecting tiny sparks into his eyes. He blocked the light, focusing only on the point of ignition. His lips pressed together, his hands did not shake. His mind, trained by trauma and endless practice, was a machine of observation, calculation, and patience. For the first few seconds the light did nothing. Just a shimmer, a faint heat mirage above the valve. Then gradually the metal began to react. 3 seconds. A faint hiss of vapor. 4 seconds. The shimmer intensified. 5. Then a fireball erupted. The lead tanker disintegrated in an instant, flames licking the autumn sky, sending twisted steel and burning fuel cascading over the tracks. The explosion reverberated through the valley, a cathedral of fire rising in a sudden, impossible display. Isef did not watch. Reflex took over. He dropped the lens into his pocket and rolled backward into the ditch behind the ridge, his body pressed flat against the frost-hardened ground. Smoke and heat billowed upward, obscuring the wreckage. The soldiers on the train had no time to react. They were consumed by the inferno before they could raise their rifles. The valley itself seemed to tremble under the force of destruction. 3 days later, in the district headquarters, Obersturmführer Klaus Reinhardt, a methodical and relentless counter-sabotage specialist, examined the scene. He knelt among the twisted metal and scorched gravel, his gloved fingers tracing the remnants of the tanker. Chemical residues, explosives, tripwires, nothing. The scene was too clean, too precise. Reinhardt whispered one word into the silence: anomaly. Whatever had struck this train had not used conventional weapons. Back in the village, Isef observed from the rooftop, hidden by the eaves and shadows. He watched as soldiers combed the forest, scrutinized the ridge and measured the angle of sunlight. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear of the explosion, but from the realization that Reinhardt had noticed a pattern. They were learning. They were adapting. And if he returned to the same ridge he would be seen. But retreat was not an option. The calculation was brutal and clear. If Isef stopped, lives would be lost for nothing. 10 men from the village had already been executed in reprisals for previous acts of sabotage, their deaths a cruel warning. Fear was the enemy's weapon, but Isef had learned to weaponize patience, observation and intelligence in return. He could not stop. He would not stop. The forest became his ally, the shadows his shield. He tracked the trains for weeks, noting every change, every patrol, every structural weakness in the tankers. Winter approached and with it, the days without sun made sabotage impossible. But Isef used the downtime to study, to improve his method, to understand the physics at play. He read stolen German textbooks, deciphering diagrams, calculating angles and predicting outcomes. He had transformed from an accidental arsonist into a strategist, an engineer of destruction wielding nothing but sunlight and broken glass. On the ridge he imagined the future strikes: bridges, trains, fuel depots. Every calculation precise. Every moment rehearsed. Isef had become a phantom of inevitability, a boy who could destroy without being seen, strike without warning, and turn the sun itself into a weapon of war. The dead man's curve had been his first proof. A single act, perfectly executed, had sent a message not with words but with fire. The Germans were not invincible. And the boy they could not see, the smallest among them, had rewritten the rules of warfare with the simplest of tools. Isef crouched in silence, the forest around him breathing with the wind, the sun climbing higher in the sky. He was exhausted, exhilarated, and aware that history had shifted beneath his hands. One curve, one lens, one boy, yet the impact would ripple through the war in ways the generals could never imagine. And somewhere in Berlin, Reinhardt adjusted his glasses, studying maps, notes and angles. He did not yet know that the enemy he sought was not a team of commandos, nor an explosive device, but a child armed with nothing but sunlight and an unbreakable will. The game had only just begun. Spring arrived in 1943 with a bitter clarity. The snow had melted from the valleys, revealing scorched earth, twisted metal and the scars of winter's frost. Isef had survived months of planning, observation and minor skirmishes with the German patrols. Each day he grew more skilled, more precise, more aware of his own limitations. The dead man's curve had proven his ability to strike, but the war demanded more. Supplies flowed relentlessly to the front. Tanks, fuel and munitions were lifelines for a machine that knew no mercy. The River Narrow Bridge was the next target. Unlike the curve, it was not a bend that slowed the trains, it was a steel truss structure vital for moving heavy equipment north. Tanks crossed it, flatbeds groaned under the weight of Tiger tanks, and fuel tankers steamed like serpents along its rails. Guards were posted at either end, their searchlights scanning the banks for mines or saboteurs. Every conventional approach was impossible. Yet for Isef, this challenge was exactly what he had been preparing for. He spent weeks studying the bridge. From the valley floor, it appeared massive, impenetrable. But from the cliffs 300 meters away it was a different story. The trusses glinted in the sunlight, the angles of the beams and rivets revealed weak points. He calculated the distance, the sun's movement across the sky, and the precise focal point that would ignite the vapor inside the tankers. Physics was his ally. And patience was his weapon. May 12, 1943. The day was clear, warm, perfect. Isef climbed the cliff, the lens carefully wrapped in a sock to prevent accidental reflection. 2 hours of treacherous ascent left him wedged in a crevice overlooking the bridge. From this vantage the entire span was visible, and the guards at both ends were mere specks, oblivious to the silent predator above. The first train appeared, a double locomotive hauling a line of tanks and fuel tankers. Isef positioned the lens in the hollowed log mount he had perfected. The focal point of sunlight shimmered faintly on the second tanker, precise to a pinhead. The slightest deviation would scatter the beam, rendering months of calculation meaningless. He had trained for this moment relentlessly. Angles, distance, tremors of the hand, patience, timing. Every skill he had honed was about to be tested. Seconds felt like hours. The train crept across the bridge. Isef whispered encouragement to himself, steadying his hands and breath. 30 seconds, 40, 50. The vapor inside the tanker responded to the concentrated light, heating molecule by molecule, pressure building. He could hear the faint hiss, the subtle tremor of steel. And then it happened. Ignition. The second tanker erupted in a fireball, contained momentarily by the steel trusses, amplifying the shockwave. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to split the air. Sparks and debris flew, scattering across the bridge. The center span groaned under the sudden force, steel rivets melting as the blast intensified. Within moments the bridge buckled. Tanks and fuel tankers plunged 50 meters into the river below, sending plumes of steam and smoke skyward, hiding the destruction in a cloud of chaos. Isef did not watch. Reflex and training guided him as he rolled backward into the forest, sliding along the cliffside. Bullets erupted around him, sharp cracks and ricochets as guards scrambled, attempting to locate the source. He was invisible, a shadow among the trees. The forest swallowed him as he fled, heart pounding, hands raw from the climb. Reinhardt, watching from Berlin's counter-sabotage office, could only stare at the reports. Bridges, curves, fuel trains, all destroyed with surgical precision. No explosives, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just fire, concentrated, impossible to trace. He called it the work of a ghost, but he could feel the pattern emerging. Someone or something was learning, adapting, striking where it hurt most and vanishing before discovery. Back in the village, Isef returned home, panting and exhausted, his small body trembling with adrenaline. Awa was waiting, her eyes filled with worry, but she said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The smoke rising from the valley was testament enough. He cleaned the lens, wrapped it in the same dirty rag and hid it in the shadows of their home. He had killed again, yes, but this time the enemy had paid for every drop of blood they spilled on his land. The victory was not without consequence. The Germans tightened their security, doubling patrols along the bridge and curve. Reinhardt deployed snipers, microphones and observation posts along every possible line of sight. But Isef adapted. He studied wind currents, cloud movement and sunlight angles more carefully than ever. He understood that to survive he needed more than firepower. He needed invisibility, patience and the cunning of a predator. As night fell over the village, Isef sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers. He was 12, a child by age but a man in experience. He had destroyed machinery worth millions, killed soldiers who would have otherwise crushed his home, and proven that intellect could rival brute force. Yet the weight of what he had done pressed on him. Faces of villagers lost in reprisals, the memory of the baker hanged as punishment, haunted him. Every victory was shadowed by a cost. And still he did not stop. Because the war had not stopped and neither could he. The bridge had fallen, yes, but the front was still alive with tanks, trains and fuel. The empire he fought against was vast, and Isef, small as he was, understood one simple truth. He could make their machinery falter, make their victories fragile, make the cost of war unbearable. One beam of light at a time. The bridge had burned. The valley trembled in the wake of destruction. And above it all, the boy with the lens waited, patient, silent and deadly, ready for the next target, the next impossible strike. The weeks following the bridge explosion were the quietest the village had ever known. Yet it was a silence laced with fear. Smoke had cleared from the valley, but the shadow of destruction lingered. The Germans were restless, and Reinhardt's presence loomed like a dark cloud over every home, every path, every ridge. Reinhardt, relentless and methodical, had pieced together the pattern. He noticed the attacks occurred on sunny days at precise times, coinciding with specific angles of sunlight. There were no explosives, no fingerprints, no debris linking to known resistance groups. The signature was something entirely new, a weapon invisible, untouchable and lethal. And Reinhardt, who had spent years hunting saboteurs, knew instinctively that the mind behind these attacks was not ordinary. He deployed new equipment throughout the forest. High-powered binoculars perched in trees, sound-ranging microphones hidden among the undergrowth, and patrols doubled along all likely vantage points. Reinhardt's notes were meticulous. He measured sun angles, mapped elevations, calculated distances. The valley itself became a trap for the phantom who had set it ablaze. Every ridge, every cliff, every stone was examined for clues. Reinhardt did not scream, he did not shout. His patience was infinite, his precision terrifying. He knew that whoever he hunted was clever, and cleverness could be caught, if one waited long enough. Isef, meanwhile, sensed the change immediately. The forest no longer felt safe. Birds startled at his approach, branches snapped beneath his feet, and for the first time he felt the weight of being hunted. He could no longer rely on familiar paths or old vantage points. The ridge overlooking Dead Man's Curve was swarming with observation posts. Reinhardt's men had studied the valley, noting subtle changes in vegetation, light, and shadow. The boy had become the prey. He retreated to the attic of his grandmother's cottage, peering through a crack in the boards. Smoke still lingered in his memory, the smell of burned metal and scorched earth. He could not forget the men who had died, nor the villagers executed in reprisal. Guilt and fear intertwined with strategy. Isef knew he could not stop, yet every step forward now carried the weight of a trap closing around him. Reinhardt, analyzing the reports, began to understand the boy's psychology. He saw patterns not just in the sunlight but in behavior. The attacks were methodical, patient, and almost ritualistic. Whoever was responsible calculated distance, angle, and precision with obsessive focus. Reinhardt concluded it could be one of two possibilities: a prodigy trained by foreign intelligence or a child. The idea seemed absurd. A child, wielding destruction with a lens, defying physics and common sense. Yet all evidence pointed to the latter. Reinhardt's obsession grew. A child. Impossible. Yet the anomalies in the reports were undeniable. Isef, sensing the tightening noose, adapted. He abandoned his old nests and log mounts. He built new observation posts, higher and further from expected lines of sight. He observed the patrols, memorized their shifts, and plotted escape routes for every possible angle of attack. He became a shadow moving through the forest, unseen, unheard, a ghost among ghosts. Every calculation he had learned in months of preparation was tested against the relentless intelligence of Reinhardt. The tension escalated as summer approached. Supplies moved faster, trains grew longer, and Reinhardt's surveillance became omnipresent. Every mission carried the risk of exposure. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. Yet Isef's determination burned brighter. He had tasted the power of his lens. He had felt the rush of bending nature itself to his will. And he understood the stakes. Stop now and lives lost in earlier attacks would have been for nothing. Then came the day that would define the hunt. Reinhardt, stationed on a ridge with his best marksman, Muller, positioned sound microphones and observation posts at strategic points. They traced the angles of sunlight with mathematical precision, waiting for the glint, the briefest reflection of glass catching the sun. Reinhardt's eyes scanned every inch of the cliffs and ridges. Time was stretched, every moment waited with anticipation. Isef approached the ridge where he had planned his next strike, unaware of the trap. Every calculation was perfect, every movement precise. But for the first time the forest felt wrong. The shadows seemed to watch him. The breeze carried a subtle tension, the whisper of unseen eyes. He paused, senses sharpened. Something was different. And it was. Reinhardt had predicted the exact ridge, the exact time, the exact angle. The boy had been outmatched not by force, but by calculation. The hunter had become patient, relentless, and methodical. Isef realized the danger and froze. The realization was instant and terrifying. This time, a single misstep could mean capture, or death. The boy who had turned sunlight into fire now understood the magnitude of the predator stalking him. He had underestimated the precision of his adversary, the power of experience against youthful brilliance. In the forest, the wind shifted and Isef ducked instinctively. The hunt had tightened. Every shadow, every glint of light, every sound carried a new weight. Reinhardt had drawn the circle, and now the boy had to escape, adapt, and survive, not just to strike again but to live. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation: the child who wielded fire as a weapon, and the master tactician who would not relent until the ghost of the valley was revealed. The summer solstice arrived, June 21, 1943. The longest day of the year stretched across occupied Poland, the sun blazing high and cruel, unforgiving in its brilliance. For Isef, it was the perfect day for one final strike, but it was also a day when Reinhardt's trap would reach its apex. Every angle had been calculated, every patrol doubled, every ridge observed. Reinhardt, relentless, had learned the boy's patterns. He knew the weapon was not explosives, not guns, not conventional sabotage. It was something impossible, something unseen: light itself. Isef had spent weeks planning, preparing for the shot that could cripple the German supply lines beyond imagination. His target, a convoy of fuel tankers heading along the Black Forest Strait, a straight stretch of rails where speed made them vulnerable but also increased the danger. He climbed the ridge 450 meters from the track, carrying the lens in a padded sock. His legs trembled from exhaustion and fear, yet his mind was precise, calculating, merciless. He wedged himself into a crevice invisible against the stone, and mounted the lens in his perfected log. Below him, the forest was alive with sound. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and somewhere far off, the whistle of the approaching convoy cut through the valley. Iceph's pulse slowed as he focused on the objective. 12 cars, 5 fuel tankers, steel frames glinting in the sunlight. Tanks, artillery, machinery, hundreds of tons of material. And all of it would be vulnerable if he struck correctly. Reinhardt's men were in position, hiding in trees and behind rocks, sound microphones listening, high-powered scopes scanning the cliffs. Muller, Reinhardt's marksman, was stationed with a rifle aimed at the only likely spot where the boy could position the lens. Reinhardt knew the pattern, he knew the schedule, he knew the angles of the sun. The boy's luck, skill, and timing would be tested like never before. Iceph's hands were steady, his lips pressed together. He whispered a prayer to the sun, a silent acknowledgement of the power he was about to wield. The first tanker approached. He focused the lens, the beam a tiny shimmer on the relief valve. Seconds ticked by, stretching into eternity. 10, 20, 30. The vapor inside began to heat, pressure building molecule by molecule. His mind danced through calculations. Angle of the sun, focal point, wind currents, reflection off metal surfaces. One error and all would be lost. A flash. Reinhardt's eyes narrowed through the scope. A glint of light bounced from the ridge. Muller raised the rifle. Iceph's heart skipped a beat. The hunter had spotted him. Reinhardt's voice was calm through the radio. Hold. Don't fire until confirmed. But the boy had no time. The vapor hissed, the steel quivered, and the fire ignited. The first tanker exploded. The blast was immediate, amplified by the steel truss of the flatbed cars. Flames erupted, twisting metal groaning under the pressure. The second tanker, caught in the same beam, ignited seconds later. Shockwaves rippled through the convoy. Tanks jackknifed, wheels melted, fuel poured over rails, igniting in sheets of orange fire. The sound was deafening, echoing through the valley like the earth itself had shattered. Reinhardt barked orders, but the boy was gone. Iceph had rolled from the crevice, darting down the cliffside, melting into the forest like a shadow. Bullets tore through branches where he had been seconds ago, ricocheting harmlessly against stone. The hunter realized too late, the prey had vanished. The boy had not merely struck, he had controlled the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, 3 tankers lay twisted in the river below, flames reflecting in the water. Tanks sank into the current, machinery destroyed, a devastating blow to the German supply lines. The valley was unrecognizable, a testament to a weapon unseen, a power harnessed by a boy of 12. Reinhardt knelt by his scope, his mind racing. He had seen the boy. He had observed the destruction. And yet he could not catch him. The anomaly remained a ghost. Back in the village, Iceph returned home, pale, exhausted, but alive. Awa, his grandmother, looked at him with eyes that bore both worry and understanding. He placed the lens back in its hiding place, wrapped it carefully in cloth. This weapon, this tool of unimaginable destruction, had done its work. But it was hers now, a memory, a legacy, a silent reminder of the boy who had changed the course of events without leaving footprints. The German occupation continued, but with a subtle shift. Convoys were delayed, supply lines weakened, and Reinhardt, reassigned to the Eastern Front, left the case file open, marked unsolved. The boy had vanished into winter mist, leaving behind scars not on the land, but in the minds of those who underestimated him. Years later, Detroit, Michigan, 1987. Joseph, the boy grown into a man, lay in a hospital bed. The world knew him as a machinist, a father, a grandfather. But the true story, the story of the sun gun, the curve, the bridge, the fire, remained hidden. A young graduate student holding a recorder asked about the war. Joseph whispered, "I didn't have a gun. I had glass. I used the sun." The story spilled out, vivid, impossible yet true. Joseph died 2 weeks later. His grave was simple, unadorned, marked only with a name. No medals, no monuments, just the faint echo of a boy who had wielded light as a weapon, who had stood against an empire armed with nothing but intellect, courage, and patience. If you hike to the old ridges in Poland, you will find scorched stones, granite vitrified by heat, witnesses to what had been impossible. The sun had been the weapon. A boy had been the soldier. And history, long written with guns and generals, had been rewritten in silence. The legacy of the Sun gun endured, not in medals or monuments, but in the knowledge that even the smallest, weakest, most overlooked among us can strike with devastating power, if they understand the laws of nature and the courage to wield them. ISEF proved one truth: you don't need an army to stop an empire. You don't need bullets to destroy. Sometimes all it takes is light, patience, and a mind unbroken by fear. And the valley, scorched, silent, yet alive, still remembers the boy who burned the Reich.